Good morning, Anthony. Can you hear us?
I can, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. That's great. Good evening to you. And
good evening as well.
so right now, with the webinar technology that we have 6 who have joined us online, but we have no way of knowing how many have joined us via phone.
Okay.
And I think Cat sent you the list as well of who we've got registered.
Yes, I got that. Thank you very much.
So
no problem.
It's now 7:30 here in Edmonton, and whatever time it is there, I think 8:30, 9:30 at night, eh?
Yeah, it's 9:30 in Asia, or a little bit earlier in some other places.
Yeah,
but
so
thank you very much for getting up so early and for helping us with this.
Well, happy to do it. So thank you you've got some keeters, I think, because everybody's here making it a long working day. So did you want to start with a few introductions, Anthony, or would you like us just to get right into it?
Yeah, sure. I can say some brief words. So first of all, I'd like to thank very much Jan and Cat for leading this webinar. This is the first webinar that the Asia Network of Women's Shelters has organized, and we're very pleased to be starting off on such a good note. This webinar is a prelude to our annual conference, which will be in Japan in November, which will also be on the topic of data collection and statistics, and using those data to do advocacy work, and how shelters can do that, and also how shelters can compare data across the region. And this is something that we've been doing in Asia since we started around 5 years ago, with our colleagues in Japan leading the way. And so we're very interested to know how things work in Canada, and also how Canada has helped coordinate through shelters across the country, and also through around the globe as well, through the Global Network of Women's Shelters. And we're very pleased to have Jan Reimer here, who's the Executive Director of the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, which is an organization of 37 shelters in the province. And she's also one of the founders of the Global Network of Women's Shelters. She was involved in the first World Conference of Women's Shelters in 2008. And she's also a former mayor of Edmonton. And we also have Cat Van Wielingen on the line, and she's a researcher at the ACWS, and she helps shelters in the province with their data collection and capacity building and training. And so she has a lot of experience and expertise in that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Cat and Jan.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and welcome everyone to this. We're really excited to be able to do this, and know you guys have also been doing some really good work on data and data collection, and probably recognize some of the challenges that are there, particularly when you start going across different boundaries, and how different people have different terminologies, etc. And I'm going to have Cat really start off the presentation, because Cat's kind of our go-to person here and really is familiar with the data. So Cat, over to you.
Thanks, Jan. So I will take us through, just let me navigate our slides here. There we go. So we've gone through introductions. I just wanted to take a moment and sort of direct you to where we are in the world right now. So Jan and I were just looking at the distance between us. So we're about a 15-hour plane ride from many of you, and almost 10,000 kilometers. And I think, what is it, Jan, 9 or 10 hours at this point in our schedules?
Yeah, almost 24, I think, for.
Yeah, for some. Yeah. So based on sort of what we understood your goals for today. We've put together some of our own goals about what we'd like to communicate about our process. It's been, I would say, the formal, and Jen, you can correct me, you've been around longer than I have, but I would say kind of our formal move towards shared measurement practice has been about 20 years in the making. So it's been a long process, and we'd really like to share some of the key learnings that we've benefited from over this long period of time working with our membership, and highlight how those learnings have informed our process and working together on collective research and evaluation. And then also to demonstrate the value that we've gained from that collective work. It is really challenging work, working together and working across differences the way that we do, but it really has served us and served the individuals that we help in shelter and in shelter-related programming. And so we'd like to share a little bit about those successes with you as well. So Jen, would you like to go around and have everyone say hello, or should we?
Yeah, just to see who's on the line. So if you could maybe just introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit about what you hope to get out of the discussion, just really quickly, and then we'll have a really good idea of both who's on the line and really try to meet your needs as well in terms of our time together this morning.
Great, and I will, because of the format of the session, I'll unmute you and ask you to introduce yourself if that's okay. So Dolly Dash, if you have access to a mic, would you like to, it doesn't look like you do. So I will move down to Ingrid. Ingrid, would you mind saying hello and sharing what you'd like to take away from today? Okay. So we may encounter that not everyone has a microphone, and that's okay. Jean Sue, would you like to say hello and share? And share your goals for today? Okay, I'll keep going down the list. Catherine Robertson, would you like to say hello and share some goals for today?
Hi, good morning. I'm Catherine. I used to work in Timor-Leste in East Timor. Now I'm back home in Canada in Victoria, so I'm actually not that far away from Alberta. And I'm really interested to hear what Alberta's been doing, and then to try and communicate that back to my colleagues in Timor-Leste, because it has been, our program there was leading the way in trying to collect data across partners and sharing with government. So it's really important, and I'm very interested to hear about the experiences in other places.
Great, thank you. Kelly Chen, would you like to share a few words? Okay, King Tsang.
They're self-muted, that's what it says.
Yeah, so if folks don't want to share, that's no problem. I'll just kind of carry on down the list. Okay, Nusrat Hassan. Okay, no worries. And lastly, Prasanna. Okay. Well, I'll just also note that if any questions or, oh, Prasanna, would you like to say a few words? Sorry, I just saw you unmute yourself there. Okay, we will just dive right in.
Sorry.
Oh. Okay, sorry about that. I muted you, but you're free now to unmute yourself and say hello. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Well, I do want to let you know that my colleague Christoph Peck, who works with many of our members on database support, is also on the line. Christoph, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. As Kat said, I work with our members on our database, providing support for data issues that may arise for our members, working closely with Kat on that. Yeah, that's me.
Great. So Christoph will be watching both the chat room and the questions area on GoToWebinar. So if you have any questions that do come up over the course of the presentation that you'd like to send our way, we'll be taking regular breaks to sort of check in and provide any clarity on the points that we've mentioned that you may want to hear more about. So please feel free to use that, both those areas, to communicate with us, and we'll check in regularly that way as well. Okay. So I do want to start with sharing a little bit. I mentioned we've been at this for about 20 years formally in terms of tracking aggregate statistics and trends in shelter services across the province. And so that journey began very manually with shelters tracking this information on color-coded paper forms, faxing that information to ACWS. And the schedule on which we relied in terms of gathering this information was pretty slow. So we began our, Jan, when did the annual statistics process begin? Was it in 2002?
Probably, government always had wanted annual statistics, so government collected them for as long as they funded shelters. So the annual data in one shape or form has been probably a feature for 25, 30 years.
And then ACWS stepped into that process in about 2002. I know that's about as far back as our historical data goes. Yeah. So in about 2002, ACWS obtained funding for shelters to receive computers, and that was a big turning point in terms of how data collection practices changed for many of our members. And around this time, many of, or I should say some, of our shelters began using electronic databases to manage their information for women and children served. In about 2009, a database that many groups were using across the province of Alberta called HOMES was coming to an end, so it was no longer going to be providing services in the province. And as a collective, ACWS and member shelters, in searching for a new database and a new platform, obtained some legal opinions that suggested government should no longer have access to private information and only really needed aggregate information to fulfill their role in terms of accountability for the funding that was disseminated to shelters. So in 2010, we moved to Outcome Tracker, and we had, I believe, 35 member organizations. So the vast majority of our members did move on to that database and moved on to that database with a common data set. And our role became supporting them from both the technical side of things as well as sort of providing oversight on the standardization of that data set. So that was a big shift in terms of our work collectively. And then in 2014, we formalized parts of that data set in our information sharing relationship with government. And so we identified some key data points that we wanted to track in a very standard way and report on regularly with government. Is there anything you want to add, Jan, about that evolution?
Yeah, I think that's, giving it from the perspective of our organization here at ACWS. We also were kind of the home base for the Global Data Count, which after we hosted the first World Conference, people, said there were certain things they wanted to achieve. And one of them was, how do we speak with a collective voice globally? So we started looking at questions that we asked different shelter networks to compile across the globe about women's experiences in shelter, and and to look at some of the differences that there were across countries as well. And we also did a similar thing in Canada, because there had been a Canadian version, and we did a day in the life of shelters, whereas in Alberta, most of our work has been, aggregated annually in terms of having all of the data from all our members that we could work with, interpret, analyze, and provide context to with government.
Okay, and sorry, too far. I will ask Jan if you don't mind sharing a little bit about the common vision that sort of grounds the collective work.
I'll just go through this very briefly, but our board has set some kind of very strategic goals that guide our work that really drive all that we do. And you see them up there, how important it is that we work collectively together, and that we work to change systems, because we know that the system's response to women sometimes is woefully inadequate. We work to share our knowledge, because there's no point collecting data if it has no impact. And we also want to change the conversation, because often the conversation about violence against women is not informed by the front line. Sometimes you have academics taking charge, sometimes you have police agencies taking charge. And from our perspective, it's really important that women's voices be heard, and that the shelter experience with women be heard, and informs and changes the conversation about violence against women. In the context of that, we have a number of different data collection frameworks that we've worked on together with our members, theory of change, then flowing from that different logic models, and then evaluation plans. So Kat, back to you.
Great. I'm just in touch with Christoph now, and he's mentioned there are a couple of questions. So okay. I feel like maybe now's a good time to get ahead of a few, and then we can carry on. So one question did come in. So we are recording this session, and we will make it available to you as soon as possible to share with your members who aren't able to attend. And Christoph, were there any other questions? Would you mind?
Yes, Dolly asked a question, might be more broad. How do the GNWS help improve the quality of services in Indian shelter homes? I'm not sure if we want to touch on that. Any thoughts?
Well, I think we'll be coming to that a little later, in that it's really the basis of why we're collecting the data is to inform practice and to change policy. And so we could give a couple of examples of that as we go forward.
Great. Was that it for now, Christoph?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay. So Jan mentioned that as an organization, we have a strategic direction, and sort of over the course of our work together, a few key documents have come out of many of these processes that really ground and provide that basis of trust for our members to share information and engage in data collection in this way. Jan, do you mind saying a few words about the ethical and moral framework?
So because of the ethics around asking women questions, their information, how you ask the question, the ownership of their data, how we work, we developed an ethical and moral framework. You can find it on our webpage as well. But it is a way of grounding all our work and making sure that it is sensitive and ethical because there's often not a lot that guides shelter workers themselves in the ethical decisions that they have to make virtually every day. So lots of professionals may have codes of conduct, standards of ethics, etc. But it's the shelters who probably are making life and death decisions every day about the kinds of services, how they connect, the type of information they share, often don't have that guidance. So we worked with an expert in ethics, and we're actually in the process now of updating it to make sure we have an Indigenous framework in it as well. But that certainly grounded our work. We also developed a shelter directors data committee. It started with looking at what kind of database do we need and what do we buy and what meets our needs of our members. And it has really flourished and is our sounding board as an agency around, what kind of data are we collecting, what makes sense on the ground, what are their needs, and so on. Our commonly affirmed database was really asking people what is it that they wanted to collect. And everybody had a huge appetite for that. So people wanted to collect all sorts of information. But the reality is that while it might be there for us to track, it's a lot of work. And so not all elements in that are currently used, but we do try to have standardized information around that and work to develop that. Hinging on that is an information sharing agreement about once we collect information from our members, how do we use it and how do we ensure that we're protecting women's identity? Because there's often, particularly if you publicize data, you don't want to ever put a woman at risk. And sometimes, particularly this was our argument with government who wanted individualized data, that they could cross-reference information from what shelters were providing and then identify the woman. And we didn't want anything that would provide that means of identification to government because there could be certainly unintended consequences to that. So our information sharing agreement talks about how we use the information. Whenever we release any information at the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, we do not do it unless we've spoken with our members and we've created context around interpreting that data. And if we have requests, as we do sometimes from, how many women are turned away in Edmonton or in Calgary or this, then we would never release that information without talking first to the members whose information we are drawing upon to release it, and then again make sure we have that common messaging and we have that context around it, which is so important. And Kat, do you want to talk about the Database Administrators Advisory Committee, because this is relatively new?
Definitely, and I think I'll just touch back to on, because I think it connects to the information sharing agreement somewhat, but we recently organized, so our database management relationship with our members requires that each shelter has a staff person who is sort of designated to provide oversight for their shelter-specific database and then liaise directly with ACWS. And our commitment to members in our information sharing agreement is that we will support that individual in the administration of their database in terms of providing them with support and whatnot. And this group has come together recently to help us in terms of the implementation process around developing the database to meet, to maintain or to develop in the direction of shelter needs. So they provide us with sort of some technical direction on how we can implement different changes that we're exploring, either to the data set or to the design of the database itself. So yeah, so it's an exciting step for us because it's really providing a little bit more efficiency in our collective process that we desperately need. Okay, and I'm just going to do some muting here. There we go. Okay. So in terms of what comprises our data set, so we have a number of activities that most shelters use in their practice that we track. So we track crisis calls, we track admissions, that type of thing. We have a number of shared tools, most of which are happening more at the project level, where some groups, some shelter groups have come together on research projects that are specific to the type of services they provide. So we track outcomes for those, such as goal attainment. We track our process, and then again, we use data to, again, wrap these more outputs and outcomes within the context of the unique experiences of women. So there's a lot of data that we collect that also supports providing that context about both the shelter experience and their experiences with violence for both them and their families. Would you like to add anything, Jan?
Well, I think if you think a bit about the question that was asked earlier a bit, once you have that information, you can also then look at, okay, why are we seeing these things happen? So if women are having, for instance, a shorter length of stay, then what are the characteristics of that woman and why? And then how do you better meet programming to do that? So, when we started looking at what are the projects that we had, we saw that women who had shorter stays also were facing more addictions issues and mental health issues. And they were also the most highly traumatized and at the greatest risk. So then we looked at how we might be able to provide better programming specifically to that group of women to be more trauma informed and then shift the practice. So it gives you an example of how when we look at goal attainment, when we look at who we're providing work services to, and then examine their experience in the shelter, you can better respond to meet the needs of the women who are coming through our doors.
And I'm noticing a couple of questions about the shared measurement. So I think it's important. I think we'll touch on it in talking about our principles, but I'll also mention it now that to the best of our ability. So yes, essentially at ACWS, what we have is a network database that can draw up data that's collected in shelters. Each shelter has their own secure database, and they can feed, or our site can roll up data from across those shelters in a de-identified way. So we are collecting data about direct service provision. So shelters are responsible ultimately for their data collection, and then we provide the support to them to perform those duties around data collection and data management. But ultimately, it's data that's collected for individualized service provision with each woman in the shelter.
Yeah, it's the power of having a collective database because each shelter collects their own data, but then we have the ability to roll all of that up to look at what's happening all across our province or within different regions, and using different tools to examine, what's happening for women's experience.
Mm-hmm. And then I'd noticed a question about whether or not government provided us funding to support this work.
No, they did not.
No.
And only recently, it took us quite a long time to develop it. And we were, and I think one of the things that happened is the homeless sector in Alberta, where we live, did get funding for all of their database capacity, but the government didn't believe that we needed that kind of funding and didn't provide any funding to the shelters or to Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. So it was up to us to, find the money first for the computers, get different grants to look at how we would set it up. And because the shelters themselves had to report to government they all needed some type of software to pull and keep track of the information for their reports to government. And because we were a network, we were able to use our collective purchasing power to first examine, what database best fit our needs, and then get a substantially lower rate because we had so many members involved. So we estimated that if each of our members, and there were 37 or so members at the time who came on the database, if they'd have each gone out and negotiated on their own to have something, it would have cost the sheltering movement in Alberta probably at least $1 million more each year. And we would not have had our own collective database then to pull that data in. So there was advantages to the shelter, but there's also advantages for advocacy of having a common online database. And I guess the good thing about not having government money is that it was a lot easier to tell them that they couldn't have any access to the database, because once we got it going, they wanted to be on it. And our board had to take a very strong position to say to government, no, you can't be on our database because there's too great a risk of you being able to access individualized data and connect it with other data that you have.
Great. So I guess going back to the basis of trust that we require to work the way we do around very sensitive information about services and women and children's experiences in shelter is being very intentional and explicit about the ways that we safeguard women's privacy throughout our data management processes. So we do a lot of work with our membership on informed consent. We have a leadership and training program that ACWS coordinates for members. It's a really exciting program that started a couple of years ago, but through that program we have delivered informed consent training and continue to develop content for members around obtaining informed consent and integrating consent throughout their service provision with women, so that there's an understanding that the information that's entered into our database has been shared with informed consent. The information that we work with internally is disaggregated information, but it has been de-identified. So within our network site, we don't see direct identifiers for women. We see some quasi-identifiers, but we don't have that level of detail about very personal either interactions between shelter staff and women or very personal details about who they are, where they're from, that type of thing. When we share information externally or publicly, that information is shared in an aggregate format to protect the identities of women. And then sort of on a project by project basis, we're very open about how we balance and work with our membership to determine the balance between retaining privacy and then the need for information. So an example of that would be in high-risk conferencing with external stakeholders. So, there are some exceptions that arise in information sharing externally when shelters themselves are engaged in case conferencing, but ACWS isn't directly involved often with those processes. And then again, just our commitment to providing a safe place for data to be stored and providing guidance to shelter database administrators and shelter staff around processes that can support the safe management of women and children's information. Would you like to add anything, Jan?
I only think the only other thing in terms of the database and the privacy is that, as Kat had mentioned, that we have the disaggregated, individualized information, but shelters also have the capacity on the database to keep case notes and other information and how to manage their own staff time. So The database itself is quite robust in what it can provide in terms of services directly to our members that we have no access to at all, but are used at the shelter level. We do provide support for them to be able to develop that capacity, but we don't have any access to that type of information as a network agency.
Great, yeah, thank you. That's a great point. And we have been touching on this, but again, just going back to that information sharing agreement, a big part of what makes the information sharing relationship work from my point of view is that the roles and responsibilities are outlined. So, you know, we make a commitment to our members that we will support them to achieve their goals related to data management. And that's sort of part of the exchange that we make to also then aggregate the data and work with it. So, like I said, they have very unique needs around information management that go beyond the scope of our shared data set, and so we are available to the membership to advance those goals. We provide regular training on database administration, so we use webinars. We tend to have a training season, but also provide very regular webinars or webinar-based one-on-one trainings with staff when they need to learn a little bit more about a feature of the database. We provide guidance on definitions that are used to collect the data, so their understanding of what a question means, what the values associated with a question mean, that type of thing. We provide quarterly and annual reports on aggregate statistics, and then provide shelter-specific dashboards to contrast against those aggregate statistics to help shelters benefit from our collective data work directly themselves, so to compare sort of what's happening in their local context with what's happening across our network. And as Jan mentioned, we liaise with our database provider and we leverage our collective purchasing power as much as possible in that relationship and in relationships with government and the like.
I think just one extra point, Kat, on the dashboards is what that does is it shows the shelter's experience over a year or over the quarter, depending on the report, with the rest of their colleagues across the province, but also sometimes we look at it, okay, this is what's happening in rural Alberta, this is what's happening in the cities, and then the shelter who's in, if you're looking at, say, what's happening in Alberta's two major cities, then the shelter would also have, you know, what's happening with them compared to the rest of their colleagues. So it's a way of really looking at, okay, well, why is our experience a little bit different than everybody else's? Or, you know, is there something around our service provision that's different than everybody else's? And it then starts getting people to ask questions to look at how they might be able to improve and up-level their service provision.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And we just actually, was that last week? It was last week. Time flies. So last week we hosted an outcomes conference with our members. We had, I think, about 60 staff from across the province in leadership roles attend. And one of our presenters was Steve Patty, who presented on the art and practice of evaluation. And I would say his presentation really resonated with us in terms of what we're trying to achieve collectively. And so we just wanted to highlight some of the principles of his work and encourage, if you're interested, we can certainly pass along some resources, but I've made his website available here too. But in terms of the process around working with data to speak about programming and sort of develop that, to shape that collective voice, these were some of the points he discussed. So really understanding that learning about your services is an act of leadership. So being engaged in ongoing learning about what you're doing really does demonstrate leadership. That it's very easy to build very extensive data sets and and be focused on the volume of data you're collecting, but really what's most important is your effect. So he uses the analogy of, you know, what is it, Jen?
Progress. Oh yeah,
Progress?
the one about the big splash.
The big
right?
splash.
So, and you can really, if you look at someone who's swimming and a swimmer, you know, if someone's there and they're not going very far, but they're making lots of splash, so they're making lots of effort. But if you look at an Olympic style swimmer, they're just gliding through the water and they make it look so easy and they get there faster. So it's really looking at not how much effort you're putting into things, but also the effect of it. But I think his comment that simple and elegant is best. It's often we have so much data and there's so many different things we can collect, and that's very similar to what happened to us when we started. Everybody said, oh, we want to know about this, that, and the other thing, and now that we can, we will. So people start collecting all sorts of data, but you know, how are you going to use it? And what is it going to show us, and how do we make a difference is really critical. So I think that whole thing about simple and elegant is best is really, I think, resonated with certainly with me, that the simpler we can make it for our members and still tell the story without collecting lots of information and really focus it on the women is critical. He talks about you know, making people critics of themselves, and it's an interesting concept, because really if we start asking questions of people, like if we ask women what their experiences are, it almost sometimes comes across like they're being criticized. And instead of making them active participants in looking at their journey in moving forward. So it's all, and it fits also with trauma and violence informed practice and ethics, but it's that, you know, putting the woman at the center and helping her with her journey and not asking questions in a way that, oh, we want to collect this data from you, but it ends up in some ways making her feel like she's the failure instead of she is moving forward, you know, on her journey to a safe and violence-free life. So it's really, in a way, it's he used the comment when he talked about it, is really to have women love themselves for what they're doing and moving forward. And so much of it is around how and the way in which we ask the question. So it was a really excellent presentation we had from him, and something I think if we had it when we started, it would have been absolutely, you know, I think a really good grounding in moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also to that point, and you know, in sort of thinking about where we've been and where we've come, I mean, it's been at least probably around a 20-year journey. And it's just to the point of there's no shortcut to insight. It's been a very iterative process and a very participation-focused process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that participation is powerful, and I think even looking at the different ways that we've done that, both with the global network, with Women's Shelters Canada, and here at ACWS, it's really involving the people the best you can on the ground to see what it is that they need to move forward. And if they have that buy-in and that participation, then you know, there's a sense of ownership. But if it's something like often government does, we want an answer to this question, go and get it, then there really isn't the buy-in, and you don't have growth and improvement of services if there's no buy-in in, you know, understanding why we're collecting this information.
Okay. So there's another question asking about what are the main challenges to this work. So do you have issues with shelters with fewer resources and staff being less able to collect consistent and accurate data? I would say we have challenges kind of at both ends of that spectrum in terms of capacity. So we certainly provide a range of levels of support to different shelters depending on what their capacity is. But we've also found that shelters with a lot of capacity, have more of a focus on kind of the direction they'd like to take their data collection and their research. And so there can be challenges also with getting, high capacity shelters to really engage with the value of collective work. And then there's also the practical challenges of working with shelters that may not have the same level of capacity or the number of staff to dedicate. So yeah, it is definitely challenging, but I would say, like, and Christoph, you may want to chime in, like we have a lot of, like, we work very closely with some of our members who do need that additional support. Like, we're in touch with some, a few times a month around, questions. So there is a level of commitment to wanting to produce quality data and to share quality data with us. I would say with, the majority of our membership. Do you want to add anything, Jan?
Yeah, I think it's, it is a growth thing, and certainly no one ever became a shelter worker because they wanted to collect data. And that's why that participation and that involvement to show how that data collection benefits women, and it benefits women in the services you provide, and it can benefit women in your advocacy, so that people really have an understanding they're part of making a difference, is a different frame. So it goes back to that participation is powerful point that Steve Patty had, that buy-in, that understanding of why you're collecting it and the rationale and keeping it simple, all help to support, I guess, that buy-in on the front line. And yes, you'll always have differences in capacity. Some of our members are much better resourced than others, but sometimes it's the most poorly resourced ones that gain the biggest benefit. An example of that would be in Alberta, where our members who have shelters on reserve get funded by the federal government, whereas all the others are funded by the province. And so we were able to measure the funding disparity and show what that is, which was a benefit to the under-resourced shelters. So it's always important, sometimes they can gain more if they're, particularly if the better resource shelters are prepared to support them in their quest for better funding. And much the same happened for second stage here in Alberta, which was never funded, and now is. It was the better resource shelters that provided support to the less resource shelters in supporting that data collection that helped to make the difference.
Yep. So where our process with members has landed today is that, again, through the data committee, we have representation of our membership in activities that set our research agenda. So they're very involved in shaping, asking the questions, okay, what do we need to know? They're involved in designing and implementing methods for collecting that information, so helping us navigate, the challenges and the realities of collecting the information that we're seeking to collecting on behalf of our collective. We work very closely with this committee and with the directors group to analyze and contextualize the results of all of our studies or projects and processes. And then again, we work very closely with them to identify the key messages and communicate those key messages to the intended audiences. And then often where we end up in that analysis and communications process is, identifying more questions and kind of circling back through the process again. So it's very iterative in terms of how we work together, but having that representation of our membership. And I should point out too that I believe members of our data committee are selected by the larger group of staff delegates from shelters. So there is a real sense that this group is working on behalf of the collective voice when they participate in these projects.
And there's also regular reporting back to the network around the progress and checking in to say, how does this work for you? This is our recommendation. Will this be okay? And then moving forward after we've got that buy-in and had that conversation. And, we change along the way to make sure it always meets those needs.
Okay, so this next section gets into kind of the details, but in that process, some key questions that we've learned we need to ask ourselves. Well, first of all, it's so important for us to really clarify and establish a collective understanding of the purpose of any data collection exercise that we engage in. So what specifically do we want to understand about our work and build together? So what piece of knowledge are we working towards? And ultimately, how do we want to use this information and use this understanding? So, we have many projects that are very much about, the development of promising practices. We have others that really do have a policy focus. And I think having a sense of where that information is going to be used is really helpful in shaping, how we collect it. Understanding what information is already available to us or that we could gain access to. Also understanding, though, that often the information that is available to us may have issues or gaps. And so, doing our best to understand what those gaps or issues might be. And Jen, you shared a great example about the DV court programs across Alberta.
Yeah, so it's often like you could get things from government and collect it. And an example of that would be if you go to a government webpage, it says, oh, we have all these domestic violence courts in Alberta. But, one of them has been closed for years. Another one has, is in name only and is actually, quite frankly, a joke if you would ask our members. So it's sort of like sometimes government says they're doing things and you can do all sorts of analysis around what government says they're doing. But if you bring it back to what's the experience the woman is having at the shelter with these systems, then you've really focused it again on the woman's experience and not on the government's glamour photograph of what they say they're doing when really it's not working. Yeah.
And I guess from there is where we get to, what additional information, to Jan's example, what is that qualitative information we would need to start filling in these gaps or building our collective understanding? So, and I've just highlighted here, it's very much a process for us. And I think the process we've landed on now really works well, but I think it was a windy road to get to this process. And Jen, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, well, nothing ever happens overnight. And, we've been at this now for, a long time, but it's also like where do you start the conversation? Because you could go to a group who, when we started, and say, well, what is it you want to know? And you'll get a lot of silence. So it's really trying to energize people around. Also, and I think I made the comment earlier that, people that are working in shelters didn't come into that to be researchers. They didn't come into it to collect data. But they did come into it because of their commitment to make things better for women. So it's really trying to draw it back and think about what are the questions that we need to know and how do we start this and engage in that conversation. So again, you have that buy-in from the very beginning.
So a little bit about formatting. Formatting our data collection practices. So asking what is the best way to collect that specific type of information we've identified we need. So is it quantitative or qualitative? we have the benefit of having a shared database, and it's a great resource to us. But that's not always, a possibility. So what are the methods and tools available? And that will, work within the context of your network. For us in Alberta, it's often addressing the differences within our collective that we need to account for in our collection methods. So speaking and working in different languages may be a challenge that's relevant to your network. The use of sheltered terms, are they consistent across your collective, or do they vary? So in Canada, we have shelters, we have refuges, we have transition homes. These terms are used interchangeably or may have some nuance for different groups and how they're used. So really establishing those shared definitions as a basis for which from which you collect information is very important. And then I think a challenge for us in aggregating is that there's often differences, and sometimes subtle, sometimes really significant, in terms of how services are provided that can have a big influence on our survey responses. So we have an example would be in our second stage shelters here, so the longer term shelters that many women go to after accessing emergency shelter. We have one in Edmonton that works specifically with refugee women who don't have status. So there's a very unique service need for that group. They tend to have different housing needs than other subpopulations of women accessing shelter. And so we, work with that data as part of our, aggregate data collected for second stage shelters, but there is some nuance there for that shelter in terms of, what the meaning is behind the numbers that they share. So being mindful of how these differences get addressed in either, the design of the survey or in the analyses. And then ultimately, and this is something that impacts us because we don't always have, a lot of funding, is what can you afford to do after all these considerations? Qualitative methods, interviews are really costly, so that just may not be an option. And so, yeah, it usually boils down to what can we afford to do as a collective, and how much can we ask of our members in terms of sharing information outside what is collected within the shared data set. Any comments there, Jan?
Yeah. Well, I think it's also, sometimes you could just ask one question or a couple of questions and have a great impact. So it's an example of that, and you'll see it a little later in the slide, is when we were first starting, we asked a question of women in terms of, why they were returning to their abusive relationship. And the two biggest ones were lack of finances, lack of housing. And we did a media release around that. And it got a lot of public attention. And as a result of that, the government introduced a new benefit for women, an escaping violence benefit of $1,000. And that's still with us today. So it was a couple of simple questions collected over a relatively short period of time, but had great impact. So sometimes it's just being really focused, looking at what is it that we can really afford to do, what's the high need here, and then moving forward with that piece. And then you get buy-in because people see the results of what they've done, and then they're ready to do more. Kat?
Yes, I'm just moving ahead here in our slides. So this section is a little bit about how we've put our collective data to work. And some of the ways that we do that. So first and foremost, it's accountability to the women and children who use shelter services. So this this is an example from a study we did in so Jan mentioned we had a group of second stage shelters, about 12 in the province, only 2 of which were funded. So the rest were fundraising their operating budgets and relying on non-provincial funding to operate. And this group of shelters came together to develop a service model together and also report on what impact they were having on the lives of women who use their services. And this report played a really big role in, the 10 or so shelters at the time who didn't have funding in getting funding. But what ultimately they were demonstrating in their work around developing that service model and then aggregating information about those services was showing how they were addressing the needs of women using their services. So upon entry,
it also helped to counter. There was an argument being made here in Canada that transitional housing doesn't work, and they were applying that to all types of housing for all types of different clientele, including chronically homeless men. And we were able to show, yes, transitional housing, second stage housing does work for women fleeing violence. So it really countervailed what the academics were saying at the time and also what was driving government policy and resulted in a huge shift.
Yeah. So the development of promising practices, so really helping us understand, are there certain interventions that are really working for different groups of women? And what are those interventions? So starting from the place of, okay, who is indicating that they are successfully completing a shelter program? And then looking further into, okay, well, what was different about their experiences within shelter? And so this is just an example of, some of the groups of the ways that we group women to sort of look at, how these factors in their lives influence their use of shelter services, and then may impact also the outcomes of their stay within shelter. For advocacy, so we have a risk assessment tool that's used by almost all of our members that assesses the level of danger women are facing in terms of being killed by their partners. And we report this, I believe, annually as part of our aggregate statistics, but we see a number of women who are at extreme danger. And that really does highlight the need for the provision of safe space for women to go. I would say another big push here is, is community-based services, so providing outreach in the community. And while those services are important, I think it's also important to highlight that there is a real safety need sometimes, or often, for women to have a place to go when they choose to leave their relationship. Do you want to add anything, Jan?
I think that's the danger assessment, now probably is Jackie Cabell's danger assessment that we use, also talks about by shelter type, because it was another argument we were able to use with second stage, that in fact we know when women leave a relationship they're at higher risk, and so they really need second stage because they need that security. They just can't go anywhere. So it also helped in making that argument to get second stage shelters funded here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd say that's particularly true in smaller communities across the province, who were the big beneficiaries of that funding increase. So for program development, so in 2012, we did what was called the Children's Project, where a curriculum for working with children who had experienced or witnessed violence was developed and piloted in a number of shelters. And this is just some of the feedback about how shelter practice was really transformed for some of our members through their participation in that project. Anything to add, Jan?
No, I think that's good.
That's good. And of course, accountability to funders. So our database also supports shelters to, meet their responsibilities to their funders. And these are some of the data points that they report on. And what we are able to do is, as a network, is then look at some of these data points at that aggregate level and say, so this example here, so in 2015, 2016, this was before a significant injection of funding went into the shelter programs within Alberta. And then in 2016, 2017, we were able to speak to how shelters' capacity to support women and children was impacted by that funding. So we had a significant increase in the number of individuals who were served through the outreach positions that were provided with that funding. And we also saw a significant decrease in the number of women and children that were turned away from shelter because they couldn't receive, shelters weren't able to accommodate them or provide them with services. So anything to add, Jen?
Yeah, well, I think this also repeated what we saw a number of years ago when government provided one outreach position to shelters. We saw, fewer women turned away after outreach because women had support after they left instead of having to try to get back in again. And we saw it again this time. So it also is a way for us to advocate around the importance of outreach services associated with women's shelters.
And this is just an example of some of the trends that we track. So we've seen, over the years, admissions declining and lengths of stay increasing, or hovering around the same. And so when we see these trends, we then ask the questions within our membership of, well, from your point of view, what is changing? What information do we need in order to, contextualize these trends or deepen our understanding of what's happening in shelter to, reduce admissions or increase turnaways, or, what's impacting your length of stay in shelter, and, developing our research agenda from there. Okay, and Jan mentioned some of the policy wins. So the Women Fleeing Violence benefit is an example where a very simple data collection exercise had a big impact for the individuals that were being served in shelter. We mentioned second stage shelters who had been operating, many of them for 30 years without funding, received funding in 2015, 2016. We have worked collectively to secure salary increases in government funding grant agreements, as well as made the case for new specialized staffing positions that address kind of the changing needs of the populations who are using shelters. We have developed some collective standards of practice. So I referred to the risk assessment, but the ongoing training and support that we provide around shelters using Jackie Campbell's danger assessment and having risk assessment and safety planning really integrated into shelter practice, I think is a big benefit to women and shelters. The ongoing development of ethical practice and informed consent, and continuing to work towards providing culturally relevant programming for changing populations and ensuring that we're meeting as broad a range of needs that are presenting in shelter as possible. Increase public awareness. There's nothing more compelling. Well, that's an exaggeration, but a good stat is very compelling. And I think we have at very key points in our journey grabbed the media attention at an opportune time, and it's really benefited our collective. And Jan mentioned as well, like that collective purchasing power. So we may not always have the funding we'd like to do this work, but we are able to offset that in some ways by working together and negotiating as a collective, because yeah, we're 37 shelters, so it is very appealing when we are, particularly in working with database providers and working on licensing arrangements and that type of thing. Do you want to add anything, Jan?
I think that's probably the public awareness too. I mean, maybe just to talk about that a little bit, is that when you have those statistics and it grabs that media attention, sometimes it can go for days and days and days. We did one survey, and it was actually not on our shared database, but we did one about men's attitudes about violence towards women. And it was the first study ever done in Canada. So it got national coverage, and it got coverage probably across the country for 6 or 7 days, and really focused on the work that we're doing on engaging men and boys. So the media attention sometimes can be, as Cat says, quite compelling in driving home your case, in helping to shift attitudes and going back to how we work collectively, we're changing the conversation, and the strategic goals that we have as our organization. I think for standards of practice too, just another point that we see often in Canada in terms of the culturally relevant programming is we do get changes in our population. So for instance, with the Syrian refugee crisis in Canada, brought in Syrian refugees. So then you're looking at, how do you accommodate and provide services for a relatively new population within shelter, and how do you reach out to that, and where are women coming to in the province in terms of these population changes. So, and which shelters may be doing a better job. So all of those things, help us to improve and support women where they're at, which is, I think, really the focus of the work we do.
Mm-hmm. I think on that note too, I was just thinking about the CAN talk.
Mm-hmm. So we've also, and that was another piece where we were able to, and I think again, because of some media attention, a donor came to us and gave us some dollars. And so now we're able to provide simultaneous translation over the phone for women who do not speak English that are entering shelter. And we're also now able to track the types of translation needs that there are in shelter, because we know what usage they're in. So interestingly enough, AMRAC is now one of the most languages, translation languages that's in demand. So we're seeing lots of Ethiopian women. So it's interesting how you see these trends, and then with the data can then inform practice, and then look at what communities you also need to reach out to make sure that they have appropriate information. And I guess another example too around that is once you have it, you can, with the men's attitude survey, the first time we did it, we found in southern Alberta there was a real lack of knowledge amongst men that withholding money and financial abuse was a form of woman abuse. And so the shelters in southern Alberta started doing more public education around what financial abuse looked like. And in the next attitude survey, we saw a decrease in the lack of, a better understanding that financial abuse was a form of abuse. So it can also help you target your public education programs.
So we have a couple of questions, Jan. And I'm going to direct this first one to you because I haven't participated in any social return on investment studies, and I'm not sure if we have done any as a collective, but the question is, how useful have they been, if we've done them, and then whether you would recommend shelter organizations do this type of study.
We have done one, Cat, and you can find it on our webpage. It's the Walking the Path Together project. It's a lot of work, I guess, from my perspective. It's a lot of work at the front line. It's a lot of work in establishing meaningful proxies for that social return. And in that particular case, we had an amazing result. We showed 5-to-1 social return on investment, but there was no interest by government in spite of that to invest. So to me, our biggest gains, it's sort of like simple and elegant, going back to Steve Patty. It's really great to have social return on investment. You can invest a lot of time and energy. So I guess so much depends on capacity. But I guess our own experience with it is that, yes, we'd love to do it because it really shows the case. Is it going to make a big difference in decision making about giving you the money? Not so sure. I guess that's, again, understanding your own local context too, and how that is. In our case, it was imposed. We had to do it as part of the project, and even though it was imposed by government, and lots of resources went into training people to do it and to capture that information, it did not have an impact at the end. But that's just one case study. I don't know what the impact has been on a broader scale.
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to really understanding kind of, if that is something that really appeals to funders, it may be worthwhile to pursue. But as Jan mentioned, in our case, that wasn't necessarily the case. So another question would be, generally, what advice would we give to the Asian Network of Women's Shelters for their data collection program?
Well, it's you know best, and so it's really an understanding from your own local context what it is that can make the biggest difference for you. And I think really grounding your conversation in, what are we going to do that's going to have the biggest return for us in terms of the investment that we want to make in the time and the energy, so that you've got the local staff at the front line who are delivering those programs having that buy-in. So it's taking the time at the beginning, but being careful around what it is you're collecting, and trying to keep it as simple as possible for your colleagues so that they can do the work that they really want to do, which is helping women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and better yet, if those data collection practices can have inherent value in terms of, the services that are already happening in shelter. I think that's...
Yeah, like I think if we were to start again, I guess just a reflection on that and the design of our database. If there was a way to design the database in such a way that it was a trauma and violence informed sequencing of questions that could build the capacity and the expertise of shelter workers who may not have all the education and understanding when they come into that role, that would be a really great thing to do. And so again, that would take a lot of thought at the beginning around how you build it and the questions you ask, so that it really is inviting women to be the holders of their information and being able to be there on that journey with you. You don't ever want to get into a situation where someone's sitting across the table with you at a computer and you're checking off check boxes, right? You want to have something where you could model a violence and trauma-informed approach in the questions that you ask of women in a way that helps guide them on their healing journey.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'd add to just as engaged as you can be with your membership in kind of that full process of identifying, what information you need and what are the best ways to collect that information. understanding that information as a collective and then, you know, communicating it. Like, I think that the fact that we've been so participatory with our members has really helped us maintain the buy-in for as long as we have of doing the work together and enjoying, you know, the successes where there have been together as a collective. Okay. So, oh, there is another slide.
That's two, yeah.
Two more. So just sort of a summary of how we've used data for collective impact. So within shelters, that continued refinement of shared measurement and common measurement. So that's ongoing, and that's really part of the ongoing capacity building that we try to support. Well, we hopefully are supporting. Data is a big part of some of the community-based work that's happening, where shelters are, you know, beyond just the shelter services they're providing, also working within their communities to influence systems, influence that bigger picture of practice that's happening across different service providers in their community. And then there's, again, that systemic impact where we are using information to engage with large systems and change the conversation about shelter services with those systems. Anything to add, Jan?
No, I think.
And
to our last slide.
Yeah, so we'll just leave this with you. We won't go through it, but this was just a summary of the last few years of work that was put together for I think this was put together for government, so we'll just leave it.
Well, it just gives you an example of some of the different things you could measure to tell your story about the work that you're doing.
Are there any questions? I didn't, there weren't a lot of microphones when we went around, but if anyone wants to send a question either through the chat room or over the questions panel, we have about 8 minutes left, and maybe some of you are eager to say goodnight, but. Okay, Anthony, did you want to make any last comments before we sign off?
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jan and Cat for their fascinating presentation, the way they took us through the 20 years that Alberta has been through talking to shelters about what data they needed to collect, and then how they battled with the government to keep control of that data. And I was very impressed about how you connect data with not just with the advocacy work and not just with getting more funding for shelters and channeling the funding in the right directions, but also how you use data collection itself as a way of taking taking survivors through the process of recovery and making them actors and stakeholders and owners of that data, and having control over that process that brings them to a recovery and away from the shadow of violence. So I think we have a lot to take back with us, and a lot to learn, especially about what you said about keeping it simple and elegant, and asking our members what they need and what they would like to collect, and also how we can do that in a consistent way to make an impact across Asia and also in the individual member countries of the Asia Network of Women's Shelters. So thank you very much. This is it's been very enlightening for all of us.
I just really thank you. It's been a real privilege for us, and wish we had more chance to have interaction. But thank you so much. It's been a real honor to spend this time with you, and thank you too for spending your evening with us. It shows a real high level of commitment to the work that you're doing and your desire to both build a world better for women, but also to really connect globally so that we can do it together. So thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be, yeah, I'm sorry that the people's microphones weren't working, but I'm sure there are more people listening than were able to actually speak and ask questions. But a lot of the people who are online at the moment will be at the conference in Japan. And so we'll follow up with a lot of the issues that you raised in our discussion in Japan. And so people can have more interaction and feedback at that conference. And also there's the World Conference of Women's Shelters in Taiwan next year. Hopefully we'll all be there for that.
Yes, well, we're looking forward to that.
Us too.
And please, if people have any questions, you've got Kat's and my email there on the screen, and feel free to connect with us at any time.
Definitely. And just a note too that the slides are available in the handout section for download. So if you want to keep a copy there, and I can circulate it by email as well, if that's helpful.
Sure. And with your permission, I'll put this up on YouTube, and so people can view it again, and other people who weren't able to take part can take a look at the presentation as well.
That's great.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.
So good evening and good morning to all of you.
Yes. Bye.
And thanks again.
Bye.
Bye for now. Bye.